June 4, 1942. The sun rises over Midway Atoll, a thin sliver of coral in the vast Pacific. The air is heavy with salt and fear. Engines cough to life, sputtering clouds of black smoke across the strip. 13 Marine pilots climb into their Brewster F2A Buffaloes, planes they already call the flying coffins. Major Floyd Parks adjusts his harness. Sweat drips down his temple. He knows the truth. Everyone whispers. These aircraft are too slow, too heavy, and too fragile for what's coming. But orders are orders. As the Buffaloes lift off the runway, their engines groan under the strain. Above them, the Japanese Zeros descend. Faster, deadlier, unstoppable. Within minutes, the sky becomes a slaughterhouse. Major Parks tries to roll away, but the Buffalo's wings refuse to obey. His radio crackles, his canopy fills with fire, and the Pacific swallows another pilot who never stood a chance. That morning, the Brewster Buffalo didn't just fail. It proved what happens when bureaucracy builds an aircraft faster than engineers can fix it. This is the story of the most pathetic fighter planes of World War II and the men who paid for their nation's mistakes with their lives. In the late 1930s, the world was preparing for a war everyone could see coming, but no one was ready to fight. Air forces from London to Berlin, Rome to Washington, were scrambling to modernize. The skies had become the new battlefield, and speed, altitude, and maneuverability were the new weapons. Every nation wanted the fastest, strongest, and most advanced fighter. But ambition outpaced reality. Factories still relied on outdated designs. Political leaders demanded miracles. And engineers, caught between imagination and material shortages, began making fatal compromises. In the United States, the Brewster Aeronautical Corporation, a small company known for building seaplane floats, found itself thrust into the center of this chaos. The Navy needed a modern carrier-based fighter. The rival Grumman F-4F Wildcat was still on the drawing board. Brewster saw an opportunity to make history. The result was the Brewster F2A Buffalo, America's first all-metal monoplane fighter to serve on aircraft carriers. On paper, it was revolutionary. Retractable landing gear, enclosed cockpit, and a sleek aerodynamic frame. But beneath its polished aluminum skin lay the seeds of disaster. Weak structural design, underpowered engines, and a weight problem that only grew worse as armor and weapons were added. Still, in 1939, the Buffalo looked modern. The U.S. Navy ordered it into production. Other countries, desperate for fighters, bought it too, including Finland, Belgium, and Britain. In Washington, the Buffalo was hailed as proof that American industry could build fighters as good as Europe's best. But optimism was a dangerous illusion. Across the Atlantic, German engineers at Messerschmitt AG were wrestling with their own demons. The Luftwaffe, flush with early victories from the Bf 109, wanted a heavy twin-engine fighter, something faster, stronger, and more versatile. The result was the Messerschmitt Me-210, a supposed successor to the legendary Bf 110. Luftwaffe leadership wanted an aircraft that could do everything: escort bombers, perform reconnaissance, attack ground targets, and fight enemy fighters. But everything is rarely compatible with excellent. The Me-210 became a flying compromise, too heavy for dogfights, too unstable for bombing, and too dangerous even for its own pilots. Its problems began not with engineering, but with politics. Reich Air Ministry officials pressured Willy Messerschmitt to skip crucial prototype testing. Production began before stability issues were solved. The result, dozens of crashes, shattered reputations, and dead pilots. Yet the program continued. Too much money and pride were already invested to admit failure. This pattern, denial, overconfidence, and political pressure, would repeat across nations. In Italy, engineers faced an entirely different challenge. The Regia Aeronautica wanted a sleek, fast, twin-engine attack aircraft to show that Italian aviation could rival Germany and Britain. The answer was the Breda WWII Linz, a futuristic machine that broke world speed records in 1939. In test flights, it looked unstoppable. Italian propaganda declared it the pride of the Mediterranean skies. But in combat, the BA-88 couldn't even climb fast enough to meet its own bombers. The plane's airframe was overbuilt. Too strong, too heavy, too cautious. Italian designers, unsure about new stressed skin technology, doubled the structure, making the aircraft nearly a ton heavier than it should have been. In the summer heat of North Africa, the BA-88 could barely take off with a bomb load. Many simply collapsed on the runway. 3 nations, 3 designs, 3 disasters born from the same disease: institutional arrogance. Each nation believed its engineers could overcome physics by decree. Each refused to listen when pilots warned of fatal flaws. And by the time the war truly began, these aircraft, the Buffalo, the Me-210, and the BA-88, were already obsolete. They would go on to kill more of their own pilots than the enemy ever could. By 1940, the world's skies had become the most dangerous place imaginable. Yet every major power was still experimenting, improvising, and pretending their designs were ready. The Brewster Buffalo, once praised in Navy briefings, was already showing its limits. Naval pilots complained about poor acceleration and unstable handling during carrier operations. Its landing gear often failed on deck landings, and the aircraft's short range restricted combat patrols. But American industry was stretched thin, and the Navy had few alternatives. So the Buffalo was shipped to the front lines anyway. To British pilots in Singapore, it was introduced as the Buffalo Mark I, their first modern monoplane fighter in Asia. To Finnish pilots in the north, it was a lifeline against Soviet bombers. And to American Marines on Midway Island, it would soon become a death trap. Every pilot who flew it quickly discovered the same truth. The Buffalo was outclassed by nearly every enemy aircraft it met. It climbed slowly, stalled unpredictably, and lost speed in every turn. Against Japanese Zeros, it was like throwing a stone at lightning. In combat reports, Marine pilots called it the flying coffin, but official channels buried these warnings under patriotic optimism. The Buffalo remained in service far too long, not because it was effective, but because there was nothing else available yet. Across the Atlantic, the Luftwaffe's Me-210 program was spiraling into chaos. Test pilots reported uncontrollable spins, unpredictable stall, and severe vibration at high speed. Entire prototypes crashed during routine tests. Yet the Reich Air Ministry, determined not to admit defeat, ordered production to continue while Messerschmitt engineers worked on the issues. The problems were structural. The Me-210's fuselage was too short, its center of gravity too far forward. Fixing this required a complete redesign. But redesign meant delays, and delays meant disobedience. So, officials simply ordered pilots to adapt their flying technique. That decision killed dozens. In early 1942, Luftwaffe squadrons received their first Me-210s. Many aircraft never made it past training. Landing gear collapsed, wings tore under stress, and crews died in crashes that had nothing to do with combat. Pilots began refusing to fly them. Some even requested transfers back to the older Bf-110s, the very aircraft the Me-210 was supposed to replace. The irony was brutal. Germany, the most technologically advanced air power of its time, had built an aircraft that frightened its own airmen more than the enemy. Meanwhile, in Italy, the WWII Lince was being paraded through propaganda films as a symbol of Italian strength. Newspaper headlines called it the Spear of Rome in the sky. But at air bases in Libya and Sardinia, ground crews were quietly fighting mechanical nightmares. Engines overheated within minutes. Fuel pumps failed in desert heat. And when loaded with bombs, the BA-88 often refused to leave the ground. In desperation, Italian crews began removing equipment, even weapons, to lighten the aircraft. The results were absurd. Attack aircraft that couldn't carry weapons. Some pilots taxied them out just for show, knowing they'd never reach combat altitude. But propaganda demanded results. So, official reports exaggerated success, claiming effective raids that never happened. In truth, the BA-88's greatest contribution to the war effort was as a decoy. Later models were stripped of engines and placed on airfields to trick Allied bombers into wasting ammunition. These failures weren't just mechanical, they were institutional. Each of these nations, the US, Germany, and Italy, shared the same blind spot, an unwillingness to admit when a project was broken. For engineers, the problem was technical. For politicians, it was pride. And for pilots, it was fatal. By 1942, the wreckage of these aircraft littered hangars and runways across the world. The Buffaloes' aluminum shells rusted in the Pacific. The Me-210s were quietly scrapped in Germany. And the BA-88s, once a symbol of Italian pride, sat abandoned in desert hangars, too heavy even to tow. But behind every failed machine was a pilot who had trusted it with his life. And it was those pilots who would pay the price when these pathetic aircraft finally met the enemy in real combat. Each of these aircraft, the Brewster Buffalo, the Messerschmitt Me-210, and the Breda B-88, failed for different reasons. But their stories converge on the same truth. War exposes every weakness, both mechanical and human. Imagine stepping into a cockpit, knowing your aircraft is inferior to the enemy's. That's what Marine pilots faced at Midway. Men like Major Floyd Parks and Second Lieutenant Charles Coons knew the Buffalo couldn't outclimb or outturn a Zero. They also knew retreat wasn't an option. Midway Island was 1,300 miles from the nearest friendly base. Once they took off, there were only two possible landings: Victory or the Pacific Ocean. The Buffalo's cockpit was cramped, its controls sluggish, and its radial engine prone to overheating. In combat, pilots described it as fighting underwater. Yet they still launched into the sky because someone had to defend the island. For the Luftwaffe, Me-2010 test pilots faced a different terror. They weren't battling enemy aircraft. They were battling their own machine. The Me-2010's unpredictable stall could flip the aircraft without warning. A single error during landing could shear off the gear. Test pilot Hermann Ziegler described one flight as riding a nervous animal that wants to kill you. And in Italy, young Regia Aeronautica pilots sat inside their Bot-88s, knowing that the propaganda posters showing the aircraft slicing through the sky were pure fantasy. One pilot later recalled, "We called it a coffin before we ever flew it." These men weren't cowards. They were trapped, victims of politics, propaganda, and bureaucratic denial. They took off anyway. That's courage, the kind that never makes it to recruiting posters. Every aircraft's design shapes the tactics its pilots can use. For the Buffalo, that design dictated one thing: survival, not victory. At the Battle of Midway, June 1942, the Buffalo's flaws were exposed completely. When Japanese Zeros attacked in disciplined formations, the Buffaloes couldn't climb to meet them. Marine pilots tried diving to gain speed, but the aircraft's weak structure couldn't handle high G-forces. Wings bent, rivets popped, engines seized. Within minutes, the air battle turned into a massacre. Of 21 Buffaloes that took off, 13 were destroyed. Pilots reported that Japanese Zeros could make full turns in half the time and climb away effortlessly. On the Eastern Front, the Me-210's tactical failures were even more severe. Its short fuselage caused violent yawing at high speed, making gunnery nearly impossible. Pilots tasked with escorting bombers often had to abandon formation just to keep their aircraft stable. As one German pilot wrote, "We were supposed to protect the bombers. Instead, we fought to stay in the air." And in North Africa, the BA-88 never even reached combat altitude. Its heavy frame and weak engines made takeoff hazardous. On hot desert runways, many simply refused to lift off. The few that did reach the sky were so slow they became easy prey for British Hurricanes and P-40s. The result was humiliation. Squadrons grounded, missions canceled, and pilots reassigned to older aircraft that at least could fly. Technology can win wars, but in each of these cases, technology was misused, misunderstood, or sabotaged by arrogance. The Me-210's core flaw came from overconfidence in early design philosophy. Messerschmitt engineers believed that a shortened airframe would improve maneuverability while reducing drag. On paper, it looked revolutionary. In flight, it was a death trap. The aircraft's balance was so unstable that even experienced pilots struggled to keep it level. Italian engineers made the opposite mistake. The BA-88 was overbuilt, too strong, too rigid, and far too heavy. Its designers didn't trust modern, stressed skin construction, so they reinforced every component with redundant steel framing. The result? A fighter-bomber that could survive a 600-mile-per-hour dive, but couldn't climb above 12,000 feet. The Buffalo's problem lay in industrial stagnation. Brewster Aircraft Corporation, a small company without large-scale production experience, was suddenly thrust into mass manufacturing. Quality control disintegrated. Aircraft rolled out of factories with loose rivets, warped panels, and engines below rated performance. When foreign customers like the British and Dutch received their Buffaloes, they were shocked to find that each aircraft performed differently. No two models handled alike. In an age when perfection meant survival, that inconsistency was deadly. Every one of these aircraft was kept alive by leadership afraid of embarrassment. In Washington, Navy procurement officers refused to cancel the Buffalo because Brewster was an American company, and canceling it would imply industrial weakness. In Berlin, Reich Air Ministry officials silenced test pilots who criticized the Me-210, fearing Hitler's anger at wasted funding. And in Rome, Italian Air Ministry officials ignored engineers who begged for redesigns, terrified of Mussolini's propaganda machine losing face. The same pattern repeated: denial, production, disaster. The men in charge chose numbers over lives. Every failure on the assembly line became a fatality in the cockpit. But war does not forgive denial. By 1942, the truth could no longer be hidden. Pilots were dying faster than replacements could arrive. Aircraft that looked modern in photographs were burning wrecks in reality. And as those wrecks piled up, each nation was forced to confront the same brutal realization. Their arrogance had killed their own pilots. To truly understand failure, you must see it through the eyes of the enemy. Because for Japanese, British, and Soviet pilots, these pathetic aircraft weren't jokes. They were opportunities. During the Battle of Midway, Japanese Zero pilots quickly identified the Brewster Buffaloes' sluggish climb and roll rates. A Zero could reach 20,000 feet, nearly twice as fast. Once a Buffalo entered combat, it couldn't disengage, not because of bravery, but because it physically couldn't escape. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai later wrote in his diary, "The Americans fought with courage, but their planes, they were like flying bricks. Once caught, they could not turn, and they could not flee." That advantage turned into ruthless efficiency for the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Buffalo became target practice, a predictable, slow-moving prey that taught them how to perfect the art of the energy kill. On the Eastern Front, Soviet pilots viewed the Mi-210 with a mix of respect and disbelief. It looked formidable, sleek twin engine, bristling with guns. But when it appeared in combat, its flaws were obvious. The aircraft's instability meant German pilots avoided aggressive maneuvers. Soviet Yak and LAGG pilots exploited that hesitation, diving in, striking once, and breaking away. One Red Air Force report summarized it brutally. The German twin-engined fighter is fast, but it cannot fight. Once cornered, it loses its balance and falls like a wounded bird. And in North Africa, British forces mocked the Ba-88 Lince mercilessly. Captured aircraft were tested and found nearly useless in desert heat. RAF intelligence reports described it as a fine example of Italian design, impressive to the eye, disastrous in the air. For every enemy pilot, these aircraft symbolized more than weakness. They represented an opponent's blind spot, the gap between propaganda and reality. A gap that in war always ends in flames. Every one of these aircraft carried not just ammunition, but lies. The Brewster Buffalo was promoted as a modern naval interceptor, yet internally, American officials already knew it was obsolete. Still, they sent it to foreign allies, the British, the Dutch, the Finns, desperate to offload the burden. To Washington, it was a political problem solved. To the pilots who flew it in Malaya and Singapore, it was a death sentence. The Messerschmitt Me-210 was even more morally complex. German engineers and test pilots repeatedly warned that the aircraft was unsafe. Some even refused to fly it. But the Nazi regime silenced them. The aircraft was too politically valuable. Too much money had been invested. Too many promises made to Hitler about German superiority. So production continued, even as pilots died testing prototypes, even as entire squadrons refused to take the plane into combat. Propaganda trumped truth, and men paid the price. Italy's Ba-88 might be the purest example of moral blindness. Before the war, the fascist regime produced newsreels showing the aircraft soaring above Rome, boasting of a new era in Italian air power. Those films were fiction, staged with empty fuselages pulled by cables. When the real aircraft entered combat, it couldn't even complete a mission without overheating. In the words of one disillusioned Italian officer, "We were not fighting the British. We were fighting lies built by our own government." That is the real tragedy of these aircraft. They weren't simply mechanical failures. They were human failures of honesty, humility, and courage in leadership. History remembers the victors. But it's the failures that whisper the loudest warnings. The Brewster Buffalo taught the U.S. Navy that innovation must never stop at comfort. The early war complacency, believing the Pacific would be fought like a pre-war exercise, vanished after Midway. Within months, the Navy introduced the Grumman F4F Wildcat, then the F6F Hellcat, aircraft built by men who had read Buffalo combat reports line by line. Germany's Me-210 disaster led to its own painful reckoning. The aircraft was so bad that the Luftwaffe had to revert to older models, the Me-110, and later hastily redesign it into the Me-410 Hornisse. That upgrade, born from humiliation, became one of the Luftwaffe's most capable twin-engine fighters. Italy, however, never truly recovered. The B-888 exposed the weakness of Italy's entire wartime industry. Too much politics, too little testing. After the war, Italian engineers themselves admitted that the B-888's failure marked the end of Italy's serious military aviation ambitions. Failure in these cases was not a dead end. It was the beginning of accountability, forced through fire and loss. In every cockpit of these doomed aircraft lived a quiet, universal emotion: shame. Not because the pilots were cowards, far from it, but because they knew they were flying symbols of national denial. Each mission reminded them that their leaders had chosen image over integrity. For the Americans, Midway was redemption. But for the Buffalo pilots who didn't return, it was an unspoken lesson. The enemy isn't just across the ocean. Sometimes it's in your own bureaucracy. For German pilots, the Me-210 was humiliation wrapped in steel. They called it Der fliegende Sarg, the flying coffin. The Luftwaffe's arrogance in refusing to admit its faults mirrored the same hubris that would later consume the Reich itself. And for Italians, the BA-88 symbolized betrayal, not just military, but personal. Men who joined the Air Force dreaming of glory found themselves fighting physics, not the enemy. These aircraft died, but their echoes lived on, haunting boardrooms, shaping post-war aviation policies, and reminding every designer that an aircraft can be technologically brilliant and still utterly wrong. From these wrecks of steel and pride rose a new kind of wisdom, one that would define the second half of World War II: adapt or perish. Because in war, the sky has no patience for excuses. By the time the sun rose over the Pacific, on June 4, 1942, the Brewster Buffaloes' fate was already sealed, not by the Japanese, but by its own engineering. At Midway, Marine Fighting Squadron 221 scrambled 20 F2A Buffaloes to intercept an oncoming wave of Japanese bombers and Zero escorts. They took off knowing the odds. The aircraft's poor climb rate meant they were still struggling for altitude when the enemy formation arrived overhead. The Zeros dove from above, fast, sleek, and deadly. The Buffaloes, slower and heavier, were caught mid-climb, perfect targets. Archival quote, Major Floyd Parks, VMF 221. "We were too slow. Couldn't even turn without losing speed. The Zeros came in like hawks. In less than 6 minutes, half of the Buffaloes were burning or spiraling into the sea. Major Parks and his wingmen never stood a chance. The Zero's machine guns shredded the Buffalo's thin fuselage. Its self-sealing fuel tanks failed, and the cockpit became a furnace. Parks went down with his aircraft, never to be recovered. Out of 20 Buffaloes, only 4 returned to Midway. Every pilot knew before takeoff that their aircraft couldn't compete, yet they flew anyway. That wasn't courage born of confidence. It was duty in the face of hopelessness. What made the Buffaloes' loss even more tragic was how predictable it was. Months earlier,
Test pilots had warned that the Buffalo was too heavy, too unstable, and dangerously underpowered. Reports reached Washington. But wartime bureaucracy moved slowly, and by the time decisions reached the front line, pilots were already paying the price. It wasn't an air battle. It was a slaughter. While American pilots struggled in the Pacific, another disaster was unfolding in Europe. The Messerschmitt Me-210, once hailed as the future of the Luftwaffe's twin-engine fighter program, had become a nightmare for its own pilots. Test pilot Oberleutnant Werner Schreiber described it bluntly. "It kills without the enemy's help." The aircraft's center of gravity was too far forward. Its tailplane, redesigned for better aerodynamics, created dangerous instability. When pilots tried to bank or climb sharply, the aircraft would snap into an uncontrollable spin. During trials, even veteran aces lost control and crashed. At least 12 test pilots died before the Luftwaffe finally halted production, but not before over 200 units had been built. Pilots begged command to cancel the aircraft. One report stated, "The Me-210 is unsuitable for combat. Its stability characteristics make accurate gunnery impossible." But the bureaucratic machine refused to slow down. Germany needed numbers, and the Me-210 was already in mass production. The result? A frontline disaster that even seasoned Luftwaffe veterans feared flying. By early 1942, pilots were openly refusing to take the aircraft into combat. Some even celebrated when Hitler approved its cancellation in April that year, a rare moment of joy in wartime Germany. The Me-210's failure wasn't just technical, it was institutional arrogance. When engineers warned about the instability, leadership dismissed them. When pilots reported deadly stall behavior, they were told to adapt their technique. When production managers pointed out the cost of continued rework, they were threatened with dismissal. It wasn't just an airplane that failed. It was an entire system that refused to listen. And then came Italy's turn, the WWII Linz. To the public, it was Italy's symbol of modern air power. Sleek, metal, fast-looking. But under the desert sun, the illusion melted away. Pilots called it il peso morto, the dead weight. The WWII could barely take off with a full bomb load in North African heat. Engines overheated, landing gear failed, and missions ended before they began. Captain Carlo Ruspoli, commanding a squadron in Libya, wrote in his diary, "We looked modern in the newspapers. In reality, our planes couldn't even climb. We were lions sent to battle with broken claws." British reconnaissance once mistook grounded WWIIs for decoys because they never saw them in the air. The truth was worse. They weren't decoys. They were real aircraft that couldn't fly. By late 1941, most BA-88s were stripped for parts and left in the sand, their aluminum frames shimmering uselessly in the desert sun. 3 nations, 3 different aircraft, one shared tragedy, pilots dying not because they were outnumbered, but because their own machines betrayed them. The Brewster Buffalo, the Messerschmitt Me-210, the Breda BA-88 Linz. Each was supposed to prove its nation's technological prowess. Each instead became a flying tomb. For the men who flew these machines, the battlefield wasn't just fought in the skies, it was fought in the mind. Imagine climbing into an aircraft you already know can't keep up. You tighten your harness, glance at your instruments, and feel that silent dread. I'm flying a death trap. That's what pilots across America, Germany, and Italy experienced. After Midway, Second Lieutenant Charles Kuhn, one of the few Buffalo pilots who survived, described that morning in chilling detail. He said, I knew before I took off that I was flying a coffin. But what else could we do? Orders were orders. When his Buffalo was riddled with machine gun fire, his engines seized midair. The aircraft shuddered violently, but Kun kept control just long enough to ditch in the sea. He survived, not because the Buffalo was strong, but because his will to live outweighed his aircraft's flaws. Kun's words decades later echoed the feelings of many pilots who flew outdated or underperforming aircraft. He said, flying the Buffalo wasn't combat, it was suicide with a flight plan. His story represents hundreds of pilots sent into battles that strategy, politics, and production pressure had already decided they would lose. In Germany, Major Walter Auer, a decorated Luftwaffe ace, flew the Me-210 and filed one of the most scathing pilot reports of the entire war. He wrote, "The Me-210 is not a weapon. It is a trap. I would rather face the enemy in a captured British fighter than risk this machine again." When this report reached command, it was quietly filed away, too politically inconvenient to acknowledge. Germany needed a success story, not another setback, and so production continued, until the accidents piled up too high to ignore. Landing gear collapsed during takeoff. Planes flipped on landing, and every death was labeled an isolated incident, not a systemic failure. By early 1942, morale within Luftwaffe testing units was at an all-time low. Veteran pilots joked bitterly that Me-210 stood for Mein Ende, my end. When the program was finally canceled in April 1942, pilots literally celebrated. Champagne bottles popped in hangars, not for victory, but relief. They had survived their own Air Force's mistake. Or Italian pilots, the WWII wasn't just a bad aircraft. It was a symbol of national shame. Captain Carlo Ruspoli, stationed in Libya, described standing beside his grounded squadron under a burning desert sun. Their aircraft, painted proudly with the Italian tricolor, sat motionless on the sand. He wrote, "The propaganda called it our Falco del Deserto, the Desert Falcon. We called it what it truly was, il peso morto, the dead weight." Ruspoli and his men received orders to bomb British positions. They knew the B-88 couldn't even take off with a full payload. Still, they tried. Several crashed immediately after liftoff, engines sputtering and wings buckling. Pilots died not from enemy fire, but from mechanical incompetence. Ruspoli himself barely survived a takeoff attempt. His aircraft stalled at 50 feet and belly landed, crushing the undercarriage. He escaped the wreckage with a broken leg and a broken belief in Italian leadership. Years later, he wrote, "They told us to die bravely, but bravery should not mean flying junk." When Italy surrendered in 1943, British intelligence finally examined captured Ba-88s. Their verdict was blunt, structurally sound, operationally useless. The Ba-88 became a cautionary tale in Allied training manuals, a reminder that appearance could deceive, and that even the sleekest design could be fundamentally broken inside. These pilots, American, German, Italian, weren't just victims of flawed machines. They were victims of bureaucratic blindness. Decisions made in boardrooms, thousands of miles away from the front lines, sealed their fate. Officials prioritized production numbers, propaganda value, and political image over performance, safety, and survival. And in the end, the cost wasn't measured in aircraft lost, but in lives wasted. At Midway, Major Floyd Parks died not because he lacked skill, but because his government sent him to fight in an obsolete machine. In Germany, veteran test pilots died trying to land aircraft they knew were unstable. In North Africa, Italian airmen were buried beside runways they never left. Their courage was real, their sacrifice undeniable. But their deaths were preventable. The Buffalo, the Me-210, the WWII. 3 aircraft, 3 nations, 1 shared tragedy. Proof that engineering arrogance, bureaucratic denial, and wartime desperation can destroy even the bravest of men. When the guns fell silent and the factories stopped roaring, engineers and commanders across the world faced a sobering question. How did we let this happen? The Brewster Buffalo, the Messerschmitt Me-210, and the Breda WWII were more than just failed aircraft. They were case studies in institutional blindness. Each one revealed, in its own way, how pride, politics, and pressure can corrupt the design of a weapon meant to save lives. The Brewster Buffalo's story ended in the clear blue sky over Midway, but its impact on American aviation continued long after the wreckage sank beneath the Pacific. After Midway, Navy and Marine Corps leadership ordered a comprehensive review of all Brewster-built aircraft. The findings were damning. Production delays, weight overruns, poor quality control. Factories that once promised precision had devolved into chaos. Brewster's management was eventually taken over by the U.S. Navy, a rare and humiliating intervention. The company that had once dreamed of rivaling Grumman and Lockheed was dissolved by 1946. But from the ashes of Brewster's failure came an awakening. American aircraft designers began to realize that survivability and performance couldn't be compromised by bureaucratic convenience. They poured their lessons into the Grumman F-6F Hellcat and the Vought F-4U Corsair, fighters that would dominate the Pacific skies. One Marine pilot later said, "Every time we shot down a Zero in a Hellcat, we were avenging the Buffalo pilots, who never had a chance." In a grim way, the Buffalo's sacrifice fueled the urgency that produced America's most successful naval fighters. For Germany, the Me-210 disaster forced a reckoning within the Luftwaffe's engineering hierarchy. The cancellation of the Me-210 program in April 1942 was both an embarrassment and a relief. Thousands of man-hours, millions of Reichsmarks, and dozens of pilots had been lost to an aircraft that never truly worked. Under intense scrutiny, Willy Messerschmitt himself was summoned before Reich Air Ministry officials. Documents from the period reveal that he defended his design, blaming the failures on premature political orders that rushed the plane into production before testing was complete. He wasn't entirely wrong, but the damage was already done. To salvage his reputation and Germany's heavy fighter program, Messerschmitt began work on a radical redesign. The Me-410 Hornets, the Hornet. By 1943, the Me-410 had corrected many of the 210's fatal flaws. It was faster, more stable, and actually capable in combat. But the war had changed. By then, Allied air superiority was overwhelming. The Me-410 entered a battlefield where even good aircraft could not turn the tide. Still, among Luftwaffe veterans, the Me-410 became a symbol of redemption, proof that lessons, though paid for in blood, could still yield progress. For Italy, the Breda WWII represented not just a technical failure, but a collapse of credibility. The Italian Air Ministry had promised the world a fast, modern strike aircraft capable of outrunning Allied fighters. Instead, they produced an aircraft that could barely lift its own weight. By 1941, most BA-88s were abandoned in the North African desert, stripped of engines, their fuselages used as decoys against Allied bombers. Their carcasses littered airfields from Tobruk to Tripoli, silent monuments to failed promises. After the war, Italian aviation faced a near-total reset. Factories were destroyed, funding evaporated, and the humiliation of the BA-88 became a dark shadow over the nation's engineering reputation. But in time, the scars produced wisdom. Italian engineers in the post-war years became some of Europe's most meticulous aerospace designers, contributing to aircraft like the Fiat G91 and later to international projects like the Panavia Tornado. The BA-88 had failed utterly, but its legacy shaped a generation determined never to repeat those mistakes. Each nation had learned, in its own painful way, the same timeless truth: you cannot outproduce physics. You cannot outvote engineering. War doesn't forgive wishful thinking. And every decision, whether made in a boardroom or a cockpit, carries a price. The end of World War II did not end the influence of these pathetic aircraft. It merely transformed their lessons into doctrine. The ghosts of the Buffalo, the Mi-210, and the BA-88 became silent instructors in every design bureau and air staff meeting for decades. The Brewster Buffalo's fatal flaw was not its concept, it was its timing. It was designed in the late 1930s, when aviation technology was evolving faster than bureaucracies could adapt. By the time the Buffalo entered combat in 1942, it was already obsolete. Heavier than expected, underpowered, and poorly maintained, it symbolized the danger of sending yesterday's machine into tomorrow's war. In post-war analyses, U.S. Navy engineers formalized new doctrines that would shape future fighter design. Every aircraft would now require extensive field testing, pilot feedback, and realistic combat simulation before approval. No aircraft would be accepted based solely on paper performance again. That new philosophy directly influenced the Cold War jets that followed: the F-86 Sabre, the F-8 Crusader, and later the F-14 Tomcat. Every one of them carried somewhere in its design DNA the hard-earned lessons from a blue-painted failure called the Brewster Buffalo. In Germany, the Mi-210's failure exposed something darker: how bureaucratic, arrogance, and political interference could destroy even the best engineering teams. When frontline pilots and test engineers first reported instability in the Mi-210, the warnings were ignored. Production continued. Reports were buried. The Luftwaffe hierarchy had already committed to the narrative of German superiority, and the truth didn't fit. By the time the Reich Air Ministry admitted the scope of the disaster, hundreds of pilots had died in preventable accidents. The German word Versagen, failure, became synonymous with the Mi-210 program in internal documents. After the war, captured German engineers like Willy Messerschmitt and Kurt Tank were interviewed by Allied intelligence. Both admitted that political pressure and unrealistic deadlines had crippled innovation. In one report, Messerschmitt stated bluntly, "We built machines for the party, not for the pilots. And that was our greatest mistake." Those words echoed through post-war aerospace programs across the world. From Britain to the Soviet Union, designers learned engineering cannot bow to politics because pilots pay the price. Italy's BA-8 program taught a brutal truth: when leadership prioritizes appearance over function, lives are wasted. Italian propaganda films had shown the BA-8 as a shining example of national pride, sleek, fast, and modern. But the reality was hidden behind studio lighting and staged photographs. Pilots knew the truth, but their voices were drowned by politics. After the war, Italian investigators studied the BA-8's wrecks and concluded that its failure was due not only to technical misjudgment, but to a system that punished honesty. Pilots who criticized their aircraft were accused of cowardice. Engineers who pointed out flaws were silenced. It was a culture that valued illusion over truth, and that illusion cost Italy dearly. This same pattern has reappeared time and again in modern defense programs when budgets, politics, and careers take precedence over the soldier or pilot who must live with the outcome. By the late 1940s, the Allied nations began introducing new procedures to prevent future disasters. In the U.S., the Bureau of Aeronautics was reorganized to ensure that operational feedback from pilots directly influenced production design. The British Air Ministry instituted flight test boards, requiring every prototype to complete thousands of hours of testing under real conditions before approval. These changes weren't born from success. They were forged in failure. The ghosts of the Buffalo, the Me-210, and the WWII stood silently behind every new fighter prototype, reminding engineers that haste kills and ego blinds. From the piston engines of 1942 to the jet turbines of 1952, technology advanced a generation ahead, but the philosophy remained the same. You cannot fake performance. You cannot order victory through propaganda. You can only build it with testing, truth, and trust. And yet, the story doesn't end there, because these lessons, painfully learned, would resurface decades later in the jet age, and even in the modern era of stealth and supersonic flight. When we look back at the vast skies of the Second World War, we often remember the legends, the Spitfire's elegance, the Mustang's range, the Zero's agility. But in the shadow of those icons existed another class of machines, aircraft that failed, faltered, and fell short. And yet, they too tell the truth about war. Each of these pathetic fighters, the Brewster Buffalo, the Bf-110, the Ferry Battle, the Italian CR-42, and the Japanese Kai-43, carried the weight of ambition and the limits of human design. They were born from rushed engineering, misjudged strategy, and national desperation. But in their failure, they revealed something far more profound, that war does not forgive mistakes, and that progress often rises from catastrophe. Behind every underperforming plane were young men who climbed into their cockpits knowing they were outmatched. They flew into enemy fire not because they believed their machines were superior, but because they believed their duty demanded it. And in that, there is no failure. These forgotten aircraft became unintentional teachers. They exposed the weaknesses of doctrine, the arrogance of command, and the power speed with which technology rendered the old obsolete. From their wreckage came hard-earned lessons that would shape the jet age and redefine aerial warfare for generations. History doesn't remember them with pride, but it should remember them with understanding. For in their story lies the essence of innovation, trial, error, and sacrifice. So the next time we look at a polished warbird gliding across a museum hangar, we must remember those others, the ones left to rust in the corners of airfields, written off as mistakes, because without their flaws, victory would have been far slower to come. Even the worst machines of war carry the fingerprints of progress. They remind us that courage is not measured by performance, but by perseverance, by those who dared to fly, even when the odds were impossible. And that is the quiet legacy of the most pathetic fighter aircraft of World War II. But what if I told you one of those so-called failures came back, redesigned, rearmed, and reborn to change the course of air combat forever? In our next episode, we uncover the incredible transformation of a fighter once mocked by its own pilots into a weapon that stunned even its enemies. Watch next the fighter they laughed at until it ruled the skies. Subscribe for more real World War II stories. No myths, no fiction, just history. Keep watching, keep learning. The war isn't over. It's just being remembered.